project, we're going to be making a quilted cosmetic bag. It has a zipper pocket in front, one handle, and a tab for opening and closing. The bag opens quite wide, and you can see that there are no raw edges inside. This project is a lot of fun, and it's great to fill with your favorite cosmetics and toiletries and makes a wonderful gift. I like to pair this project with my lip gloss holder, which works great as a zipper pull, and the link to this project is in the description below. This is a somewhat challenging project, so you want to make sure that you set aside plenty of time, especially the first time you make it. I hope you enjoy this project. Let's get started. For the main fabric of the bag and for the lining, I'm using cotton fabric. This bag can be made with fat quarters for each. However, if you're planning to wash and dry your fabric, it may shrink a little. Normally what I do is wash and dry my fabric first and then cut a fat quarter from there. So if that's the case, you would need a little bit more than a half yard. Similarly, if you're new to quilting and worried about being a little exact, you might want a little extra fabric, 1, to play with, and 2, just in case things don't line up perfect. But I have also made this bag with fat quarters straight from the store, and that worked great as well. So whichever you're most comfortable with is just fine. You're also going to need just a little bit of woven interfacing. This is Pellon's SF101, and it's 2 inches wide. This bag requires 2 zippers, a 14-inch or longer zipper for the main pocket, and an 8-inch or longer zipper for the smaller pocket. I like to use a zipper that's exactly the correct length because it's a little more cost efficient. If you don't want to have to worry about running into zipper stops, or you don't want to see them on your project, go ahead and use zippers that are just a little longer than what's indicated. That will make the construction a bit easier. If you do get a zipper that is too long, I recommend nylon coil zippers. That way you can easily stitch over the zipper teeth. I'm using purse zippers. Purse zippers are just a little bit wider. This has a 1 1/4 inch wide tape, which is really nice, and it has a slightly larger zipper pull. Regular zippers will work just fine, so if you aren't able to find purse zippers, that's okay, but if they're available for you, I like these best. I'll put a link on my website for where I got my zippers. The fabric of the bag is quilted together, and in between the layers of the main fabric and the lining, I'm using flex foam. This is Pellon's version of the flex foam that does not have tricot on the outside. So this is what they call their naked flex foam, to where it's just the foamy part. There are several different versions you can get. This is a sew-in version of foam, but there are some that are fusible. I really like this one because it's very affordable, but because it's not fused, the fabric does move around just a little bit more. You could also use batting or fleece interfacing if you don't have the foam. For this project, you also need about 2 yards of single fold bias tape. You can buy the bias tape or make your own. This was made using a fat quarter, which makes about 5 yards. You only need 2 for this project. I made this using a 1-inch strip wide of continuous binding. I used a 12mm bias tape maker to fold the edges to the center. To begin, let's quilt our fabric. First, cut an 18-inch square from the main fabric, lining, and foam. If you're new to quilting fabric together and you're worried about being exact, you might want to cut a little larger, such as 19 by 19. When I begin sewing this project, I like to make sure that I have a lot of thread ready. This project looks much better when your thread coordinates with your fabric and with your zipper. I like to have thread that matches the exterior of the bag, the zipper of the bag, as well as the lining of the bag. This may mean that you have up to 3 different colors that you're using when you sew this project. Similarly, before I begin, I like to make sure I have the same colors of thread in bobbins ready to go. So for each color of thread I'm using, I have a full bobbin to go with it before I start. It can be quite time consuming to be consistently changing your thread and your bobbin for your project. However, I found that it's worth it. It just makes the final result just a little bit nicer. If you're worried about that being a problem when you're sewing this project, you can make sure that your main fabric, your zipper, and your lining all coordinate with the same color thread. It really does save a lot of time and it looks nice in the end. Or if you don't mind contrasting thread, you can just use the same color the whole time either way. It's totally fine whichever way you pick. Just know that a lot of your stitching will be visible on your final project. Begin by taking your lining fabric and laying it right side down. You do want to make sure that the fabric is nice and pressed. Then lay your foam or your batting directly on top of it. Keep it as flat as you can. Then take your main fabric and lay it right side up on top of all the others. I found that the fabric actually rests quite nicely on the foam. Smooth out any bumps and wrinkles. And now I'm going to draw myself a guide for my stitching line. From corner to corner, I'm using an air erase marker. Whatever you use to mark your line, you want to make sure it's something that will vanish or something that can be erased. You don't want to see this on your final project. From here, I'm going to stitch across the line on my sewing machine. I'm going to be using a walking foot, which I recommend since we're going through so many layers. My walking foot has a guide that I put on the foot so that I can measure a certain distance away from the edge. Because of that, I only have to draw one line. I can simply draw this diagonal and then base every line that follows off of it. I'm going to keep all of my lines 1 inch apart. If your walking foot does not have a guide that you can follow, you can simply draw all of the lines that you'd like to stitch on. To hold it in place, I simply like to use clips around the edge. Okay, now that it's lying nice and smooth and flat, I'm ready to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to do my quilting with stitch length 3.5, and my machine cuts the threads for me, which is really nice. If your machine doesn't do that, you want to make sure to trim the threads as you go. That will make it easier in the end, and it will also help ensure that the thread tails don't get caught in your stitching. I also really like to, after I sew a line, I always like to check the back side after every row. That way, if something doesn't work out right, if something got caught or puckered or something like that, I can fix it right then. It's much easier to restitch one line than to restitch 5 lines. And I've definitely made that mistake where I haven't been checking the back. I do the whole thing and then I turn it over and I'm like, whoops, and I end up having to redo quite a bit. So it's just a good habit. After every row you stitch, just check to make sure things are looking nice. I'm going to be stitching with the main fabric right side up. So for my top thread, for the needle, I'm going to be using this light teal. But in my bobbin, I'm going to have the dark teal. So that on my quilting pattern, on the top, I see this, but on the bottom, I see this. To do this, you really have to make sure that your machine is set at a good tension. So if you have some extra scraps to play with, it's a good idea to test it first to make sure your machine is stitching the way you want to before you stitch on your fabric. Once my machine is threaded, I'll be ready to go, and let's get started. I'm going to stitch corner to corner across the square. Then I'm going to stitch additional rows parallel to that 1 inch away. And I'm going to do so across the entire square. I'm ready to start quilting. I have my machine set to stitch length 3.5. I'm going to stitch exactly on my line. I'm going to have to be careful as I guide the foam. I want to make sure it doesn't get caught on my machine or on the wall that's behind my machine. So as I sew, I'm going to have to curl and roll up the edges of the fabric to make sure it doesn't get stopped or blocked as I sew. If it gets caught on something, for example, my clips hitting the edge of the table, it will stop the stitches, and then the stitches will go from long to small, and that doesn't look so great. So if possible, pay attention to where your fabric is going, roll up the sides and edges as you feed it through your machine, and if there's anything that it's going to hit. You can backstitch if you like, but it's not absolutely necessary since we're going to be cutting pieces from the fabric anyway. You can see that I'm rolling up the fabric so it can pass through the machine. I'm also smoothing the fabric as I go since my foam does not have any fusible adhesive to it. Now I have to stop and prevent it from hitting the wall. So I've angled my fabric up so it's good to go. Looks good. Now I'm going to take my stitch line that I just stitched and I'm going to line it up with my guide. My guide right here, which is the super handy dandy paper clip, is 1 inch away from my needle. So it's going to help me create 1 inch spaced lines. So I'm lining my guide up with my row of stitches and I'm going to keep that guide in the stitch line the whole time I sew. And I'm checking the back. And I'm going to repeat that process for this entire side. Then, once I reach the end on the left, I'm going to flip the fabric around and do the right hand side. I've now quilted my fabric all in this direction. It's hard to see on this print, but let me show you the lining. On the lining, you can see it a little bit easier. Let me zoom in here. You can see all of the stitches that I've done parallel to that first line. Now that I've done this, I'm going to go back and I'm going to stitch perpendicular to these. So I'm going to flip it back over to the right side. All of my quilting lines are going this way, so I'm going to switch and I'm going to draw a line this way. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line corner to corner, and I'm going to repeat the process stitching in the other direction, and this will create a diamond pattern on my fabric. My fabric is all quilted. I have stitches going in both directions. Now that my quilting stitches are complete, I'm going to trim up the edges. So any areas in which the foam is sticking out, where there are not both layers of fabric or where there's just fabric and not foam, I'm going to trim it off. That way, when I go to cut my pieces, I don't have to worry about one of my pieces not having what it needs to. If you have a rotary cutter, those work great for this step. So you can kind of see that here. Right here on this edge, you can see that the lining is sticking out. I'm going to trim that off so that I clearly know where the edge of my fabric is. On this side, it's a little hard to see, but I also have some foam that's extending. and I'm done. Now I know when I cut my pieces, they'll be going through all layers of fabric. When I'm done quilting, I like to press my fabric again. This helps to set the stitches and it shrinks up the fabric just a bit to help get rid of some of those unwanted puckers. I usually use steam for this. Now is also a good time to clean up any unwanted threads that may be sticking out or stuck in your stitches. Here on the edge of my lining, I have some little strings that are stuck in my stitches. Now is a good time to pull those out so I don't have to worry about them later. For your bag, you also need some fabric for the strap and tabs. For mine, I'm using one rectangle of the main fabric and one rectangle of the lining fabric, but you could do it all of the lining or all of the main fabric, whichever you like. And my tab is going to match the main fabric. The handle pieces are 2 by 8 inches. The tab fabric is 2 by 2 inches. I'm going to go to my ironing board and I'm going to lay these pieces right side down. Then I'm going to grab some fusible interfacing. This is Pellon's SF101 and I'm going to cut it a ½ inch shorter than my fabric. So this was 2 by 8, this is 2 by 7.5, and I'm going to center it so that I can eliminate bulk in my seam allowance. I'm going to do the same for the little tab piece. Instead of 2 by 2, this is 2 by 1.5, and I'm going to center it, leaving a ¼ inch exposed on each end, and press. If you'd like to, you can also put interfacing on the lining, but you don't have to. Now I'm going to mark the center of each piece. This is 1 inch from the edge. I'm going to do this on all 3. Again, I'm using my air erase marker. And then I'm going to press the edges to the center, creating 1 inch strips. If you're worried about burning your fingers, a silicone spatula works great to hold this in place. I also like to use a tailor's clapper to seal in the heat. And while that's setting, I'll work on the others. Now I'll take the lining piece and lay it right side down. And take my main piece and lay it right side up. I want the folded edges to match, and I'm going to pin it together. On this step, I like to sew pretty close to the edge. I'm going to sew with a 3/16 and 1/16 seam allowance, but if that's too tiny for you, you can also use a 1/8 and 1/4 on each side. I like the 2 rows because I think it looks kind of decorative and pretty, but it's totally up to you. Just 1 row of stitching on each side would be sufficient. But again, I'm going to do 2 on each side. I'm going to do the same on the tab piece. You don't have to use your walking foot for this step. Mine just still happens to be on my machine. So you can use your regular foot if you prefer. And press. We're going to start by attaching the zipper. To do this, you're going to want the 2 long skinny rectangles for the main zipper panel, as well as your long zipper. The first thing you want to do is place the rectangles as you would like them on the final bag. I want to have my zipper pull on the left-hand side, and I want the two panels to fit together like this. So this one will be on the top here and this one on the bottom. I'm going to start by connecting the zipper to the top piece. So I'm going to take the zipper and I'm going to place it right side down on the rectangle, and I'm going to align this edge. I'll move this one out of the way for now. If you're using a regular 1-inch wide zipper tape, you can simply align this edge of the zipper exactly with the edge of the fabric and it will be just perfect. Since my zipper tape is just a little bit wider, I'm going to have to let it extend a little bit. I'm going to flip this whole thing over so you can see. So I'm going to let the edge of my zipper hang off about 1/8 of an inch. And again, you only have to do this if you're using a wide zipper. The pattern only gives 1/4 inch leeway for the seam allowance. So since my zipper is going to be wider than that, and it will actually come in useful later, so I'm going to leave just a little bit hanging off the edge. Also, when I begin, I'm going to keep an eye on the placement of my metal tabs. I'm going to be sewing this project with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I really don't want to hit that metal. So I'm going to make sure that the metal stopper is at least 3/8 of an inch away from this edge. I want this end to be the same. I find that my zipper is just the right size to fit for both ends. If you find that your zipper doesn't do that, if it's a lot longer, that makes it a whole lot easier. You can just let it extend on both edges so you don't have to worry about the stoppers. Or if it does hit in your seam allowance on one side, that's okay. You just have to remember where that is so that when you're sewing, you can make sure to avoid that because you don't want to hit any metal with your sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to flip this back over so I can align my zipper and get it pinned in place. So again, I'm going to start with the metal stopper about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, and because my zipper tape is wide, I'm going to let it hang 1/8 of an inch beyond the edge of my fabric. Again, if you only have a 1-inch wide zipper, then you don't have to do that. Since the opening of my zipper is just a little bit shorter than my fabric, at some point this zipper pull is going to be in the way. So when I'm sewing, I'm going to keep an eye on where this is, and I know that before I get to this section, I'm going to have to stop, put my needle down, and close the zipper a little bit so I can stitch past this area. So let's head to the sewing machine. I'm ready to get started sewing. I currently have the top thread of the machine threaded with thread that will match the main fabric on the outside of the bag. My bobbin thread matches the zipper. For me, those two colors are the same, but for you, they may be different. Notice I also have the zipper foot attached to my machine. I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from the edge of the fabric. So since my zipper tape extends, it's going to be 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the zipper tape and 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. If you're using a 1-inch wide zipper tape, then you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm also using stitch length 3. You'll find that the fabric can be a little bit puffy because of the foam, so if it is, you can use a purple thing to help lay it flat. I can feel that I'm getting close to the section that has the zipper pull. Because of that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to lift my foot up and I'm going to move the zipper pull back behind the foot. Now I know that's not in the way of my sewing, and I'm going to keep going. Oh, let's put the foot back down. There we go. Now that the zipper's attached, you'll see that it kind of pokes up. Because of the foam, it just really wants to stand out, and we need it to lay flat. It's definitely not right now, so what we're gonna have to do is top stitch it. And the top stitching is actually really helpful. Not only will it help the section to lay flat, but it's also gonna hide this seam allowance right here. Since my zipper tape extends beyond the edge of my fabric, when I fold this over to lay the zipper flat, it completely hides that raw edge, which is really nice. If you used a 1-inch wide zipper, yours may not do that. So when you fold it over to make your zipper flat, you may see a little bit of the foam still. If you don't like that and you don't want to see that foam edge, you can trim this seam allowance to be 1/8 of an inch. Just be careful, make sure that you do not actually cut the zipper tape. The zipper tape is going to hide the fabric. Make sure you pull the zipper tape out of the way and trim the foam and fabric down to 1/8 of an inch. Then your zipper should extend a little beyond the fabric just like mine does. And when you fold this over, your seam will be hidden. I'm now ready to top stitch. If you lay your zipper flat, you can see this sticks up a little bit. Take your fabric and keeping the zipper flat down, fold the fabric away from the zipper teeth. We're going to top stitch to make sure it stays this way and it hides our raw edge. So I'm going to head to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's 1/4 inch away from my previous seam line. And that will have the benefit of holding this flat and hiding my raw edges at the same time. When I do my top stitching, I'm going to use stitch length 3.5. And again, I have my thread set so that the top thread matches my exterior fabric and that my bobbin thread matches my zipper tape. And let's head to the sewing machine. I'm now going to switch to my regular sewing foot. You can continue to use your zipper foot for this if you like, but I find that my regular foot works better. So again, I have my sewing machine set to stitch length 3.5. I'm going to be stitching 1/4 inch away from my previous seam. Check to make sure that the zipper tape has been stitched down all the way along that back edge. You can see that I now have one side of the zipper panel attached to the zipper. It's time to attach the other side. So I'm going to grab the second rectangle, make sure it's in the correct position. So this was the top, this was the bottom. So this is the edge of the fabric that I want to be touching the edge of the zipper tape. So I'm going to keep an eye on this edge so I make sure I get it aligned correctly. So I'm going to flip it over and align that edge with the end of my zipper tape. You want to make sure that the sides of the rectangle match up with the sides of the previous rectangle that you attached. Again, Since my zipper tape is wide, I'm going to let it extend 1/8 of an inch beyond the edge of my fabric. So at the top, I'm going to make sure that my rectangles line up. I'm going to let it extend 1/8 of an inch beyond. And I'm going to put a pin to hold it in place. I'm going to do the same all the way down. And I'm going to make sure that my rectangles line up at the bottom as well. And I'm going to head back to the sewing machine and stitch just as before. Check to make sure that the zipper has been stitched in place all the way across. Now press flat. Now we're ready to add the straps. I have 2 straps that we've constructed. This is the short little tab that will help us when we're opening and closing the zipper, and this is the handle. I like to place the handle on the side with the zipper pull, and I like to place the tab on the other end. But it really doesn't matter which side you place them on, you can choose whichever works best for you. Depending on if you're left or right-handed, it might influence your choice. I'm going to start by adding the handle piece. I'm going to fold it in half so that the raw edges are touching. I like to have the lining fabric on the inside, but if you'd like it to contrast, you can fold it the other way if you prefer. Now that the 2 raw edges are together, I'm going to move the zipper pull out of the way so that it's in the middle of my panel. And I'm going to align these 2 edges. You want to make sure that they're nice and straight, and you want to make sure that there's not a large gap. I usually like to take a Wonder Clip and clip them together at the end. Now I'm going to take the strap piece, which I've already folded in half, and I'm going to align it in this same section. As you do this, keep an eye on the metal zipper stops. We're going to be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If these metal stops are in the same spot as your seam allowance, you want to make note of that. That way, when you sew, you don't accidentally hit them. I'm going to line up the raw edges of the strap fabric with the raw edges of the rectangles. Make sure it's centered and straight. You want to make sure it aligns with the direction of the zipper. This handle usually fits perfectly in between my 2 rows of top stitching, and then I'm also going to clip that in place. Then, on the other end, I'm going to place my other tab. Again, I'm going to fold it in half, and this time there's not a lining piece, so I want to make sure that the section with the raw edges is on the inside. So when I fold it, I want those hidden. Here are the raw edges on my tab piece. Notice the placement of my zipper stop. This zipper stop is in my seam allowance, so I'm going to have to be careful when I sew and make sure I don't hit that. I'm going to align the raw edges with the raw edges of the rectangle. I'm going to make sure it's going straight in comparison with the zipper, and again, it lies in between my top stitching lines. And I'm going to clip this in place. Right now my zipper tape is a little bit in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. The two tabs are now clipped to each end. I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew across the tab and the end of the handle with a seam allowance that is just slightly smaller than 1/4 of an inch. And when I do so, I'm going to keep an eye on the placement of my metal tabs, and when I get to that section, I'm going to turn the knob by hand so I don't hit it with my machine. On the end of my zipper just here, this is where the zipper pull normally goes. I want this to stay nice and closed, so I'm going to pinch this together where the zipper would be when it was closed, and I'm just going to put a few stitches in this end on the seam allowance. I'm now ready to sew the section with the handle. If you recall, on this end, my zipper stop was not in the way, so I can just sew straight across. This is quite thick and the fabric does tend to shift, so make sure you've got a pretty good grip on it and go slowly. If things move around, you may have to do this part more than once. Now I'm ready to stitch the other end. This side is a little easier because the zipper doesn't open. However, my metal stopper is in the way. So I'm going to sew a little and then I'm going to stop before I get to that spot. So here's the middle of my zipper teeth right here. And I'm going to sew just a few stitches and stop before I get there. I can feel the metal stopper right here. I'm going to stop before I get to that point. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my needle by hand. And I'm basically going to lift my foot up a little and jump over that metal stopper. And then I'm going to keep sewing. Now my tab is attached, but I did not hit that metal section. Now that the tabs are attached, we're ready to add the final pieces onto our gusset. You need the two bottom pieces. These are the small sections that are curved on one end and flat on the other. The flat end will go next to the zipper. So you want to take each of your pieces and lay them right side down along the edge of the zipper panel. And we're going to stitch across the bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, be careful of the position of your zipper stoppers so that you don't accidentally hit that metal. I have my sewing machine threaded so that the top thread is the same as the lining fabric and the bobbin thread is the same as the main exterior fabric. I'm actually going to sew with this piece on the bottom so that I can see the metal stoppers if necessary. So you can see the metal stoppers right here on mine, so I'm going to make sure I stop before I get there. And now I'm going to move the needle by hand. I had to jump just a little. Now I'm going to repeat on the other side. Now that the flaps are sewn on, I'm almost done. But if you look at the back side, you'll notice that we have some really not cute raw edges here. So how you finish this can vary depending on your preference. I like to finish it with binding because it makes it look really nice. If you prefer not to do that, you can overcast or zigzag. But as I said, I'm gonna finish using binding. The first thing I'm gonna do is trim off these ends of the zipper. You could see that my zipper tape extends beyond the seam allowance. I'm just gonna use my craft scissors and cut that off. And now I'm gonna grab my binding and I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to cut a small piece of binding the same width as my panel. Sometimes I like to cut it just a little longer to give me a bit of extra space. I'm going to open up one of the folded edges and align it with the raw edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to stitch in the ditch and be careful of my metal stopper. Notice that the binding is on the side with the zipper. That's important. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Cut a strip of binding just a smidge longer than your zipper panel. Place it right sides together and then open up one of the folded edges and align it with the raw edge of the zipper panel. Then go to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch. So this will be a 1/4 inch seam allowance exactly in the fold. Take care to make sure you don't hit your zipper stops. An optional step that you can do that can be helpful when working with foam is to compress your seams. This works really great using a zigzag stitch if you have a zigzag. My machine only goes straight, so I'm just going to use a second row of straight stitches. But in the seam allowance, I'm just going to do another row of stitches to help this lie flat. Again, this step is optional, and if you do use a zigzag, just make sure it doesn't go over your seam line. Make sure all of the stitches lie within the seam allowance. Next, take your zipper panel and take the end piece and flip it so that it's flat. Then take your binding and roll it over towards the short side. And we're going to stitch the binding in place. Notice it's covered that seam allowance. And we're going to stitch the binding in place with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance, really tiny. And you can see that it lays nice and flat and that seam is covered. And because I changed the bobbin thread to be the color of the main fabric, you really can't see it very much on the front. So let's repeat on the other side. Again, flip the small flap to the end, fold the binding over towards the short end, make sure that raw edge is tucked in, and stitch with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. And the gusset is done. Next up, we're going to be adding the pocket to the front. The first thing we're going to do is attach this zipper to the front of the pocket, and then we'll take this pocket and put it on the main panel. So I'm going to set this aside just for a second. I have the front pocket laying right side up. I'm going to take the zipper and place it right side down on top of it. You want the zipper to be centered. If your zipper is longer, let both metal tabs extend beyond the edge. Mine is exactly the right size, so I'm going to try to have the metal stops be as far end to end as possible. And I'm going to sew the zipper to the top panel just like I did the main zipper panel. I'm going to let my zipper extend just about 1/8 of an inch beyond, and then I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the edge of the fabric. That would be 3/8 of an inch from the edge of my zipper tape. If you are using a narrower zipper, you can align it with the edge of the fabric precisely. Feel free to go ahead and pin this in place if needed. I've switched to the zipper foot on my machine. Now that the zipper is attached, I'm going to flip it up. And I'm going to top stitch along the edge to hold that zipper in place. You want to make sure that the zipper is laying flat so that it covers that seam allowance. And if you need to, especially if you were using a smaller zipper tape, you can go ahead and trim this seam allowance. Just again, take care, only cut the fabric and foam, do not cut the zipper tape. I find my regular foot works best for this step, but you can use whichever works best for you. For this step, the top thread is the color of my main fabric and my bobbin thread is the color of the zipper. You just want to make sure that the width of your top stitching is big enough to hold down the zipper tape and hide that seam allowance. In order to attach the pocket to the front main panel, we have to know where the zipper goes. So we have to mark that zipper placement curve here. So take your pattern and trim it off at the curved zipper placement guide. Line it up with your panel piece, aligning sides and bottom edges. And trace the curve. I'm using an air erase marker. Then I'm going to take my zipper panel, face it right side down on top. I want to align it so the edges of the pocket match the edges of the panel. It might start a little curved like this since our zipper is curved, and I'm going to begin by aligning this edge here, and I'm going to sew the zipper in place, and as I do, I'm going to be moving my zipper to follow that curved line. As I stitch this in place, my top thread is the color of the zipper and my bobbin thread is the color of the lining. And I'm actually going to sew this in place twice. I'm going to sew with about a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance so that the width on the zipper is the same on each side. If you have a narrower zipper, I would do a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to stitch again with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance just to hold the edge of the zipper tape in place so it doesn't flip up later. I have the pocket attached to the main panel, and as you can see, the zipper is hiding the seam allowances on the inside. When your front panel lays flat, the edges of the pocket should align with the edges of the main panel, and the bottom edge of the pocket should be about a 1/4 of an inch shorter than your main panel. So you can see how the edges here do not line up. That's on purpose. So again, the pocket should be a little bit shorter and the side edges should align. So if you need to, go ahead and trim the pocket to fit. You don't want to trim the main panel because that's the size we need for our gusset when we join our pieces together. But it's okay to trim the pocket if you need to. The first thing I'm going to do is finish the edge of the pocket here so I don't see this raw edge. I'm going to open it up and lay the pocket so that it's flat. And I need to mark 1/4 inch from the bottom edge. You can do this a couple ways. You can do a row of basting stitches, or you can mark it with a fabric marking tool. Just be careful that you don't see this on your final project. So I'm going to use my ruler to draw a line 1/4 inch from the bottom using an air erase marker. So you can see I now have a guideline at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck the edge of the fabric under at that line. The bottom edge of the pocket will now be about 1/2 inch shorter than the main fabric. Go ahead and pin this in place if you need to. When I sew this edge, I'm going to stop frequently and I'm going to make sure the edge is turned under as I go. And you want to sew this in place using a pretty small seam allowance, about a 1/16 of an inch if you can. An 1/8 of an inch is okay if you can't get quite that small. If you'd like to, you can also make yourself a guide on your main panel to show where it should line up. Again, that's about 1/2 inch from the bottom. I have my machine threaded so that the top thread is the main fabric and the bobbin thread is the lining. The bottom edge is now sewn down nice and flat. But if you open your pocket, you'll notice that you can still see those raw edges inside, and I would prefer not to have that. So what I'm going to do now is sew one more time. This time I'm going to sew again 1/4 inch above my previous stitches, and that will encase the seam allowance that's inside the pocket, and that way I don't see the seam on the outside and I don't see it on the inside. The second row of stitching is done, and now you can see that the inside of the pocket looks just as nice as the outside. Make sure your zipper is closed and make sure your pocket is laying nice. I have found that sometimes when doing this step, the fabric does slide a little bit in the direction that you're sewing. You can use a walking foot to help prevent that, but I've found that the change is really slight for the most part. So I'm just going to flip it over and I'm going to trim that little section off. Again, I am not adjusting the size of my main panel. I am only trimming the pocket. And now it's nice and straight. To complete the main panel, let's attach it to the back. Take the two pieces and place them right sides together. And let's sew along the bottom edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. To compress the seam, I'm going to sew along the edge one more time. I'm going to sew in the middle of the seam allowance to help it lie flat. You may want to check to make sure everything looks nice first. You can also do this step with a zigzag, and it is optional, but I do find it helps the seam to lay a little bit nicer. We've sewn and compressed the seam, so now the two panels are attached. You'll notice we have this really ugly raw seam. Let's go ahead and hide that. You can either overcast it, use a zigzag again to finish the edge, or bind the seam. I'm going to use binding. So I'm going to fold it back in half, and I want the pocket piece to be on the top. And I'm going to grab my binding, and I'm going to cut a piece of binding that's just a smidge longer than my panel. I'm going to open up one edge of the binding, and I'm going to align the raw edges. The fold of my binding should sit on the seam allowance. And now I'm going to stitch in the ditch. I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch away, which should be right in that fold there on top of my previous stitching. My machine is now threaded so that both the top and bobbin thread are the same color as the lining. At this point, I like to check to make sure it looks nice. You can see that I can see a little bit of my previous stitches. I don't want that. So I'm going to go back in with just a slightly larger seam allowance, make sure I hide that. And that looks much better. The binding's attached, and now I'll open it up, and I'm going to press the seam allowance and the binding towards the back panel. So just fold it over towards the back panel, and your binding should cover the entire seam allowance. If it doesn't cover the entire seam allowance, you can trim that seam allowance a bit. And now I'm going to sew the binding in place with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. And I have my machine threaded so that the top thread is the lining and the bottom thread is the main fabric. That center seam is now nice and hidden, and the last thing I'm going to do to complete the main panel here is to trim off the edges of my binding. I'm not going to trim off the zipper tape yet because that's kind of a nice reminder to me to know where the zipper is and to keep an eye on those metal stops, but I am going to trim off the binding. So I'm just going to make sure that this is nice and straight. I'm also going to trim off any straggling threads, and we're ready for our next step. We have the front and back panels connected, as well as the zipper gusset, and so now we need to connect the two together. This is probably the most challenging step of the project. It can be a little awkward to wrap the two together and sew around those tight curves. So before you begin, one thing you do want to decide is how you're going to finish the inside edges. You can simply sew it together and leave the edges raw. You can sew it together and then zigzag or overcast around the edge, or you can bind the edges with the binding tape. My preferred method is to use the binding, but it is a little bit more challenging. But I do think the results are really nice in the end. So I have 1/2 inch wide single fold bias tape. And I actually find it easier to attach the binding now rather than later when it's already attached. You can do it later if you want, and you can do it by hand if you prefer. But for me, I'm going to do it all on the machine. And I find it a little easier to work with when it's flat. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to turn this so that I'm looking at the lining side. And I'm going to set the gusset panel aside for a bit. And I'm going to attach the binding to the main panel. The first thing I'm going to do is open up one edge of the binding. And I'm going to tuck in one end about 1/2 inch. When I place the binding to start, I like to place it on the edge of the back panel. This is the panel without the zipper pocket. Just makes it not quite so bulky. And I don't like to start right at the center because of all the seams. So I usually start somewhere in the middle. I'm going to align the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the back panel, and I'm going to keep this edge folded. I usually like to attach them using clips, but if you don't have clips, you can use pins. Just only pin to the lining layer of fabric. Don't try and go all the way through the foam. If you like, you can go ahead and clip this all the way around the edges, holding it in place. When you get to the corners, just make sure it's a little snug. Just give it a little gentle pull so you don't end up with any wrinkles in the corner, and clip all the way around. I actually prefer just to adjust it as I sew. So I'm going to start with it down here, and then I'm just going to align as I go down. And I'm going to remember when I see the little ends of my zipper tape to make sure that I'm not going to hit that metal stopper. Also, I want to make sure that my zipper pull is in the middle. You don't want to accidentally hit that. And you also don't want to end up with it actually sewn off of the bag so you don't have a zipper pull. And this section here where I moved the zipper, since the zipper tape does like to roll, and I need to make sure it stays in place when I sew around, I am going to use another clip over here. Just to hold that in place. And you can see I do have my 2 metal stoppers right here that I'm going to have to keep an eye on. And I do have my metal stopper here that I'm going to have to keep an eye on. So when I sew around my edges, I'm going to have to be real careful. And I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm stitching in the fold of the binding just as before. Now I'm at my zipper tape. I know my zipper stop is somewhere around here, so I'm going to move it by hand. And there it is. I'm going to pull the binding a little snug around this corner. I've arrived at my zipper tape, so I'm going to move this by hand just to be safe. And now that I've stitched over that section, I don't need the clip anymore. When you get back to the beginning, overlap, and then clip off the edge of the binding. Now that my binding's attached, I'm ready to add the zipper gusset. To make sure that the 2 pieces are aligned correctly, I'm going to mark the centers. So I'm going to take my pattern piece. If you have one that hasn't been trimmed off, that's great. But I can see that the center line is right here. So I'm going to mark that. I'm going to do the same on the other side. You can measure the center on the side gussets if you like, but it's usually pretty easy to find. It just extends down from the zipper. You also want to mark the center of the zipper panel. I usually do this by simply folding it in half. Identify the side of the bag that you want the zipper pull to be on. When the bag is closed, I want the zipper pull to be on this side. I have put this together backwards on more than one occasion, and it is not a fun step to redo, so you want to be careful on this step. So since I want the zipper pull to be on this side, I'm going to align this edge of the zipper panel with this side of the bag. So if this lies flat, place them right sides together and align your middle seam where the 2 panels are connected with the center of the side panel here. Clip in place, taking care to make sure that the binding on the other side stays in place. Then repeat on the other side. Now align the center of the zipper panel with the center of the front. And align the other side of the zipper panel, the center, with the center of the back. Remember to keep an eye on that binding to make sure it stays in the correct position. And next, you're going to clip everywhere else. It may be a little tight in the corners. I usually like to clip into the gusset to make it just a little wider. When you do this, just be really careful. Keep your clips to 1/8 of an inch or less. We are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and we don't want to accidentally end up with any holes in our bag. So I usually like to start from the bottom and go up, and then I'll do these corners last. You can clip the main back panel if you have a hard time going over the curves on the end of the gusset. So here it looks like I need just a couple. If you'd like to, prior to clipping this in place, you can compress the seam on the front and back panel. Not only does that help the seam to lay flat, it also helps all the little seam allowances to stay in place so that they don't roll down. This can be a little tricky to align, especially in the thick places where you have the pocket. Just have patience on this step. It does take some practice and it's not uncommon to have to redo it. Sometimes things just don't line up perfect and the best way to get it to fit is just take it off and try again. The good thing about this step is it is finally starting to look like a bag, which is very satisfying. Okay, now I'm ready to do the top corners. You'll notice on the top corners, it's the front and back panel that's curved, and it's the zipper gusset that is straight. So in order to make the straight piece form around the curve, I'm going to do a few small clips along the straight edge of the zipper panel. Remember to keep them small. Now I'm going to fan out the zipper gusset to fit the curve. And sometimes you just kind of have to stretch it a bit. Okay, it's all clipped together and it kind of looks like a bag now, although a bag with a lot of bling. I'm now ready to sew the zipper panel to the front and back of the bag. This is without doubt the hardest part of the project. It does take patience, exactness, and a little bit of arm muscle. As you sew, you have to manipulate the position of the bag to be in the best possible location to sew. If you prefer, you can hand stitch this or at least hand baste it so you don't have to worry about all of the clips. When I sew, I find I like to have the curved edge on the bottom. That means when I sew the front and the back, I want it sitting in my sewing machine like this. However, when I sew the curved edges below the zipper, I want it sitting like this on my sewing machine. So I will be stitching this in different sections. I'm going to stitch first the front with this part on the bottom as I sew. And then I'm going to stop and backstitch and I'm going to flip it over so that this section is on the bottom while I sew. And then I'm going to stop and backstitch and I'm going to continue sewing the rest with this section on the bottom and so on. So I'm going to stop and start several times and I'm going to move the bag so that it's in the best position for me as I sew. It may also be very helpful to have the zipper open. It will help me be able to move things out of the way as I sew. It will also help me be able to lay sections flat. So one of the reasons I like to have the curved section on the back is that way as I sew around that curve, I can see this straight rectangular section and I can move it out of the way and make sure that I don't have any pleats. For the color of thread you use for this, it's really your choice. Sometimes if stretched, you can see the little stitches on the front, but you could also see the same inside. So it's really up to you which one you prefer. I'm probably going to sew with my top thread, that of the lining, and my bobbin thread, that of the main fabric, because that's what I'm going to need for the step that follows. Since this step is so challenging, it is helpful to be in a good mood and fresh and ready to sew when you do this step. It's not a fun one to do when you're tired or just want to be finished. So make sure you're refreshed and ready to start something challenging when you do this step. As I sew this section, I'll try to keep my hands out of the way so that you can see clearly what I'm doing, but that may be a bit of a challenge, so I apologize in advance if you don't always have a clear view. I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The zipper tape tells me to be careful of the stopper. The zipper tape tells me to be careful of the stopper. Now I'm getting to the curve at the bottom of the zipper, so I'm going to backstitch and stop. And I'm going to turn my bag the other direction. Now the curved zipper panel is on the bottom. And now I'm going to sew around this curve. And for this tight curve, I'm trying to stitch exactly on the lines that I used when I attached my binding. I know that binding is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's okay if the curved edges extend just a little bit. And I'm going to go up to meet my previous stitches. And I'm going to repeat that same process for the other 2 sides. My zipper panel is all attached, and now before I move on to my next step, I'm going to check to make sure everything looks okay. I'm going to make sure that I caught all of the seam allowances and that my stitches are on approximately the same line as my binding. And then if that all looks good, I'm going to compress the seam as before. When I compress the seam, I like to do so with the binding side up. That way I can make sure it's in the right position. Everything's all attached, which is great, and I've compressed the seams. Now I'm going to trim my threads. I'm also at this point going to trim off the ends of my zipper tape. This does mean that from now on you don't have an indication of where those metal stops are, so you will need to keep an eye on that yourself. The last thing I'm going to do is trim my seam allowance just a smidge. You don't necessarily have to do this everywhere, but it does make the step just a little bit easier, especially in the corners. If you have any foam that's hanging off, which I usually do, I'm going to trim that to be just a little bit shorter. I'm going to trim off about 1/16 of an inch. Do be careful that you don't accidentally trim your binding. I find it's really helpful to make sure to trim the foam in the corners, because that's usually the hardest section to bind. But since I compressed my seam, I have 2 rows of stitches in between the edge of my fabric and my seam line, which will make it quite strong. My last step is to sew down the binding. I'm going to take the binding and flip it up and over the seam allowance so that the binding edge touches the zipper gusset panel. And then I'm going to stitch that binding in place with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. You can also slip stitch it in place by hand if you prefer. So again, we're just going to be folding that over and hiding our seams. The trickiest part to do on the machine is right at the side seams here because that's quite bulky, so you do need to go pretty slow there. It can also be a little tricky at the bottom corners, so I found that on these corners I pretty much have to sew a box. So when I get to the corner, usually what I do is fold down the side, fold up the bottom, and then I'll sew with a 90-degree angle. I find that this is a little bit easier to do with the fabric turned right side out. Make sure to push all of your corners out. Oh, it looks like a bag. And so what we're actually going to have to do is sew inside the tube. So I'm going to lay it on my sewing machine with the zipper gusset flat. Fold the edge over like so. And then stitch along the edge. This will probably be quite the challenge to film on camera, since you pretty much have to be inside the bag to see what's going on. But again, if you prefer, you can do this step by hand instead of on the machine. What you do want to make sure of as you sew this part is you want to make sure it doesn't get folded back. Do make sure that zipper panel is fully extended as you sew. And I'm going to sew right along the edge of a binding with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. You do want to make sure that you have your sewing machine set with the bobbin thread, your outside fabric, and your top thread, your lining color. Also for this step, I would avoid starting at the top center because you don't really want to see that back stitching. I'm going to start somewhere on the side. And we've finished. Our bag is done. Just clip any lingering threads and we're finished. I like to finish the bag off with a matching chapstick holder. The tutorial for this project is listed in the description below. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, happy sewing!